And I took a litho course, and like that was it. Upon like graining my first stone and like drawing and like the crayon marks and the touche and the flats, I was like, oh, this is the shit.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. Each week, I chat with artists who use print-based media to do something beyond the expected. This is a bilingual podcast, so if you subscribe to us, you'll be getting episodes in English with me, as well as in Spanish with Ronaldo Gil Zambrano. Together, we speak to printmakers around the globe about their practice and passions in the world of printmaking. Hello, Print Friend is brought to you by Speedball Art Products. In 1915, Ross F. George published the first edition of the Speedball textbook, which quickly became the superlative resource for artists and letterers of all ages and skill levels. This is a great resource for the gig poster gang or folks who just want to develop their own fonts for screen printing and relief printed work. In celebration of the 105th year anniversary of the first edition's debut, the 25th edition of the Speedball textbook has a convenient lay-flat construction and 120 pages of examples, contributors' works, and innovative technique insights that's sure to inspire and appeal to scribes and enthusiasts across the spectrum of skill and experience. There's a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Brian Wagner, who you may know from their fantastic Instagram handle, HedgeBitch. We talk about going to Tamarind in the autumn of 2020 in the heart of the COVID pandemic, witchery and lithography, bootstrapping lithography back into your life after grad school, and rural queerness. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to cast a spell with Brian Wagner. Hi, Brian. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm really good. I'm so happy that you can join me today.
Me too. I am so excited.
It was so nice seeing you in Madison and getting to connect a little bit there and, well, getting to see everyone after so many years of pandemic. But
right?
Yeah, but it
like,
was...
I feel like I know all these people from internet land, and then like, especially with the pandemic, it was like multiverse.
Right.
Internet land, and now it's like, oh, all of these people are real people.
What are you doing out of my computer? Who let you out? Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to having a chat about you and your work and your experiences and just having a good time talking prints. So as you may know, if you've listened to basically any episode of the podcast ever, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. And I always say these are the who you are, where you are, what you do kind of questions.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Brian Wagner. I am a printmaker and lithographer based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I did my Bachelor of Fine Arts in studio art with an emphasis in print and book arts at the Minnesota State University Moorhead, and then took a year-ish off in between graduating and applying for the Tamarind Institute, and then just got back about a year ago-ish, June 2021, from the Tamarind Institute, and now I've just got a very small studio space and been making prints that way.
Yeah, you came onto my radar when you were accepted to Tamarind. Tamarind does their Instagram post where they're saying, like, here's all our people, and saw you sort of appear through there and followed you. And since, as you say, you've been back in Minnesota, you've been doing just these beautiful, tiny little prints, these little intimate little lithos that are such little snippets of stories, it seems like. So I definitely want to talk about that experience of life after grad school, life after trade school on the other side. That transition, which I know is often a time when artists feel like they lose their footing a little bit because they've had all the resources to the resources that they can get.
Yes.
But before we get into the now, let's step back into the past a little bit. And can you tell me where you grew up and what role art played in that part of your life?
I grew up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, about 30 minutes southwest-ish, in this little town called Shakopee, which is now not a very little town at all. But a lot of my time was spent as a young child. My mom grew up on a farm, and I'm actually a twin. I have a twin brother, and so the grandparents were free babysitting. So my twin and I spent a lot of time on the farm with grandma and grandpa, and more so in the vicinity of the farm with grandma and grandpa, and then just like running barefoot through the fields and the woods
Mm,
of South Minnesota,
yeah.
southwest, not really. It's like right, like south central Minnesota, really. But my dad is a carpenter by trade, and he still has them hanging up in his wood shop. They're these little, I think they're shim boards. They're only about like 1 inch by about 5 inches, but whenever I would be out in the workshop with him, he would give me like a carpenter's pencil with one of the flat ones and just let me draw. And would draw cars and trees and normal kid things, but on scraps of wood. And I think he still has them hanging up in his workshop somewhere, which is really funny. And it's like, Brian, age 6. Like,
That's great. Well, those are
um,
going to be essential to your Smithsonian archive.
yes,
Absolutely. Yes.
they will appear in some sort of exhibition someday. But yeah, I was always a pretty artistic child. I still liked to run around. Shakopee is a river city, so the Minnesota River runs right through it. So I always had access to some deep, deep woods and marshlands and that sort of thing, which I didn't think would be as formative in my art, but is starting to
Mm.
make a resurgence recently.
I was going to say, I feel like I'm seeing some of this in your current practice. You're talking about this farm and the rural space outside of it. I've maybe even seeing it pop up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's started to take a little bit of an interest as I've grown, and as a queer non-binary artist, I feel like it's important to my identity as a person of
Mm.
these like formative years as a child running through the rural Midwest for the most part. But yeah, I grew up doodling and was very into nature, and honestly could not have I did not care about sports at all. My parents did try. Both my older siblings were hockey players, and as a Minnesota family, like that's just what we do.
Mhm.
But I was not really interested in sports. We tried soccer. It wasn't really my thing. And then I actually started playing piano, I think when I was 7 or 8,
Mm.
and was very, very musically interested. And that was a lot of my focus throughout junior high into high school was music. I was in band, I was in orchestra, I was in the pep band, I was in jazz band, I was in percussion ensemble, I was doing extracurricular lessons. I was at school at 6:45 in the morning for
Mm.
rehearsals or to be in a practice room practicing. And I think in high school in all honesty, I think I took one art class, and it was a photography class. And then that was my artistic career in high school. I mean, I always carried a sketchbook with me, but I didn't really do a lot of art classes.
Huh.
And then when I graduated high school, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I had known since I was in like 7th or 8th grade that I was going to go to school and be a bassoon performance major. And that's what I did
Mm.
for a little bit. And then it just didn't really feel right. And I was being pushed towards, oh, well, you're a performance major, but you're not going to be playing in an orchestra. You're going to have to teach. And I just didn't really,
Oh.
it wasn't really what I thought I wanted. So I started off at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and then my twin was looking at transferring, and so I said, "Oh, why the hell not? We're basically codependent." So I transferred with him to MSU Moorhead, and my first semester there, I was an art major with a focus on drawing and illustration was where I got my start. And I mean, that was what I was always doing as a kid. Into like I even with the music and everything else that I was doing, like I always was drawing something.
Mm.
And so drawing and illustration made sense. And then as you do, I think I had to take like an introductory printmaking course as like outside credit for a drawing and illustration for my major, and I took a print class, and I took it with Pat Vincent, and he was my first little intro into the printmaking world. And the first 2 weeks, well, 2, 3 weeks of the class, I was having a lot of fun because all of a sudden I was having this meld between my drawing and the graphic side of print that I wasn't quite getting in like a drawing class, because it was always like still lifes and nude modeling and that sort of thing. And I was like, okay, this is fine, but this isn't really the subject matter that I'm super interested in. And so print, all of a sudden I could explore these different subject matters in whatever way that I wanted to. But the first couple weeks of class were relief printing. And I have mad respect for relief printers. I am not one of them. I struggled so hard. Like, you think that there would have been a connection between my dad being a woodworker and like
Yeah, I
being
kind
able
of
to
thought
like,
that's where this was going.
and like, it's not like, I mean, I was very drawn to like white line woodcut and white line relief carving, but it was not quite the mark that I wanted. And then I think we did a little bit of collagraphing. We did a little bit of screen printing. And I liked the ease of screen printing, and the layering was a little bit more immediate. And then we did dry point, and I really liked that because that was more illustrative, right?
Right.
Like, it
I
was
mean, that
drawing into a
connection
matrix.
to the sketchbook life is
Yes.
right there. Yeah.
And I think we did a polyplate litho section, and that was fine, but I mean, it's polyplate, so I was like, oh, it can either go well or it cannot. But then it was in that moment of between intaglio and polyplate that I was just like, I think I want to be a print major. And so I talked to Pat. I was just like, I think I want to switch to print. Like, I think I want to switch out of illustration and into print. And he's like, well, why don't you just hang on to the drawing and illustration major and just have a dual emphasis? Like, just do both for a little bit and see what you like. And I was like, okay. And so I added printmaking as an emphasis. And so I was a printmaking emphasis and drawing and an illustration emphasis. And then the next semester, it was a little bit bittersweet because, I mean, shout out to Pat Vincent, that he really sparked my love for print. And then after my first semester of printmaking, he left MSU to go teach at Austin Peay University. And made a career change, which I'm very happy for him for doing. But then the next semester, I had Corinne Teed, and I took a litho course, and like that was it. Upon graining my first stone and like drawing and like the crayon marks and the touche and the flats, I was like, oh, this is the like this is what I have been missing my entire life, both as a drawer and as like a newfound printmaker. I was like, well, why didn't we do this in intro? I would have like absolutely loved this. But it also, like, within my drawing practice, I finally was, oh, this is the mark that I've been after. I felt like it was like my entire life, which I was only 21 at that point. So I was like, oh, this is revolutionary. But it was like, oh, you were so young.
Yeah.
But yeah, all of a sudden it was like, oh, well, forget graphite, forget charcoal, forget pen and ink. I want to do litho.
Yeah.
And then that was it. No one could stop me from doing litho. We had our assigned litho, and then I was working on 3 other lithos on the side. And then I think the next semester was a relief paper and book arts. And I do love book arts, but we kind of talked about how I feel about relief. And I think I did one other woodcut, and then I was like, I'm just going to do letterpress. Like, that was my way out of having to do a relief print. But then along with that class, outside of class time, I also had 3 other lithos going. And my professor was like, well, this is a relief class. And I was like, oh, this is just extracurricular.
Yeah.
And that's really where I think my lithography journey really like kicked off. I just could not get myself away from it.
That's so beautiful. I feel like we're so lucky to find something that can be such a calling in our lives when we do find it. I think there are people who live 90 years and never connect with something in the way that it sounds like you connect with litho. Just hearing you talk about it, it's like you're describing meeting a true love for the first time across the room. Like, it was their hair, it was how they walked. Like, it's like it's there in it. It really feels like you were meant for it.
And I've always had this affinity for antiquing, and like I grew up in kind of a thrifting household. Like, we never really bought anything brand new. It was always like, well, we're going to go to the thrift store. And so then when I found out that litho is like this like age old tech, obviously all of print is has this rich history, but it just felt like the process of reusing this stone just felt really intuitive to me, because I was like, oh yeah, this is how I was raised. We just reuse it. You grain it down and you draw something new.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been in print studios before when they've pulled out a stone that someone else needs to use, or a publishing studio, and they pulled out a stone someone else needs to use, and there's just this stunning drawing on it, and they're so cavalier. It's just like, well, here comes the grit, but it has that. I think there's something beautiful about that ephemerality of it, and as you say, the reusing, this idea that this stone has so many lives. It's not like
Yes.
a block of wood or a copper plate. It's gonna have this journey that it goes through, all touched by these different hands, by these different artists. And then one of my favorite things that was ever pointed out to me about litho was from Elizabeth Jean Yance, when she was like, it's alive, it was alive, like they've got personalities. And that has such a romance to it that I think is specific to litho, between the organic material and the fact that you spend all of this time on your image, and then someone's going to just come by afterwards and scrape it away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, God help whoever go on a date with me, because it's that age old dating question of like, well, what do you do? And it's like, well,
Yeah.
get ready, because not only will I geek out about the art of litho, but I will sit there
Mm-hmm.
for an hour and a half and I will tell you about how these stones are alive.
Yeah.
And like I get like a weird twitch in my eye, but I'm just like, it's lived a life, and you can find these like different sedimentary deposits in it, and they were quarried out of this specific quarry, and like
Let
my
me
dates are
tell you
like,
about
okay.
Bavaria. Yeah.
Yes, and my dates are like, okay,
I
like, what did I stumble into?
there was a meme that shit posting printmaking, or was it
Oh
is it
yes,
printmaking shit posting? I can't remember their
yeah.
handle, but it has that I've went on a date and I talked about printmaking and they didn't call me back. The only thing I could think of is I didn't offer them enough information about
About
printmaking.
printmaking,
Yeah.
yes. Exactly.
Yeah,
Oh
it's really good because it's true, and I've often talked about on the podcast how it feels like that there's something about printmaking that's in people's genes, because either you see it and you just do have that darling where have you been all my life reaction, or you try and explain it to someone and they just glaze over. They just,
oh yes.
it's just, why would you ever care about this? And it's so interesting to see that as someone who interfaces with the general public about printmaking through my work in commercial galleries over the last 10 years, and then also just being out in the world, and you're at a party and someone will be like, Brenda has a podcast. And you're like, oh, what's your podcast about? And I think it's kind of similar to the date question of like, what do you do? And you're like,
Yep.
okay, how much time do you have? How much patience do you have? Yeah, so I understand. I definitely want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about your Tamarind experience and decision to go there. And of course, being there in the
Yes.
pandemic, being a unique class in Tamarind
Yes.
as well. But I just want to get out of the way. I really want to ask you about your Instagram handle, because every time I see Hedge Bitch, I think it's someone who's like really snooty about someone else's landscaping. It's just like someone who's just like, you call that a topiary? Like, I don't know. But it's just so funny. And I'm like, is it a printmaking joke that I'm not getting? I love it, but I think about it and I haven't cracked the code.
It is okay. I mean, I love the new take on being snooty about topiary, and I think that might be what I have to go with. But it is not print related, which is, I mean, that's all that my Instagram is print
Yeah.
stuff. But I have not had the gall to change it. I think I have some litho related username saved
Yeah.
just in case I ever decide to make the change. But at this point, I'm so attached to Hedge Bitch. Like when people are just like, "What's your Instagram?" They're like, "Let me write it down." I'm like, "You're not gonna have to. Like, you can't." I'm like, it works for me.
You're not going to forget this one. Yeah.
So for all intents and purposes, I consider myself a witch. So, and there's a specific subsection of witchcraft that is called hedge witchery, which is solitary witchcraft. So, practice when within and of yourself. And hedge witches are considered to be tenders of the hedge. So, we kind of like oscillate between solitary and like stepping into whatever dimension you want to consider what we're living in right now. But that's kind of where it comes from. And hedge witches are also take on a lot of like the quality of a green witch. So a lot of like herbalism, a lot of plant based practice. And if anyone has seen my apartment, they know I have so many plants. I think I have like 60 to 70 house plants
Oh my
at
gosh.
this point, and this is either going to be really cool to some people or really nerdy or maybe a little bit both, which is totally okay because that's
Both can
kind of
be
my brand.
true. Both can be
Um,
true. Yeah.
so, especially in the summers here in Minnesota, I spend a lot of time on the North Shore here in Duluth, actually, which is where I am right now. And I, there are some really, really amazing hiking areas up here, and I have, I think, 3 or 4 different copies of like wildflowers and where to find them, like guides. And I am always plucking different wildflowers or plants that I find fascinating that I want to either incorporate into my work or just study. And it's kind of something that was sparked by my mom. She carries a pair of garden shears in her car, and she will stop on the side of the highway and run down into the ditch and cut out flowers. Now, whether that is a sustainable practice, I'm not going to weigh in on that. It's just how she is. But that's kind of where it started. And that kind of lends itself to like my hedge witchery, which is where my Instagram comes from.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I love that. Yeah. I have known people who are really into bonsai who have a
Yes.
similar practice of just stealing plants that they are drawn to. And pro tip for your mom, if she wears a reflective vest while she does it, no one will question it. They'll
Yeah.
just say she must be with the city. She can like,
she
just
tends to she tends to go in the middle of the night sometimes. She's definitely taken me on. She's like, "Do you want to go on a walk?" And it's like 11:30 at night. And I'm like, "Yeah, sure. This is normal." And she like darts into somebody's yard real quick and comes back with a cutting. And I'm like, "I don't think that's legal, but I'm not gonna snitch."
I love it. You come by it honestly, is what it sounds
Yeah.
like. You definitely come by it honestly. That's lovely. Cool. Okay. I had to satisfy my curiosity.
Yeah.
And do you find that witchery and lithography feel like they're overlapping a little bit in terms of kind of ritual and hidden forces and ancient
Absolutely.
stones? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like it makes me feel like an alchemist a little bit,
Mhm.
right? When you're like mixing up etches or you're weeding through the tamarind manual and you're just like, well, what does this mean? And it feels like it was written by some crazed witch a century ago and you're trying to decipher their practice. But I think it's, I mean, it's the part of lithography that I think is really, really instinctual for me is that I like to say that I'm like a right-brained artist where I obviously have this creative side, but I am so list-oriented, A-type. I'm a double earth sign. Like
Cozy.
I can't help myself but like be analytical. And so to have lithography, you have these just like steps in the process feels really natural for me because I'm like, oh, there's one, and step one has the sub steps of like, oh, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you move on to step two, and then you do this and this. But it does feel really, especially when I'm like etching a stone. There was a stone that I was etching, I think down at Tamarind, that just had this beautiful touche wash on it, and I think I spent about an hour and a half etching it. But I didn't mind because it's just me and the stone, and I've got my earbuds in. I'm listening to either podcast or I'm a huge classical music fan. So I'm either listening to Debussy or Shostakovich. There's no in between. And so I'm just kind of like in my zone, just spending time between myself and the stone or myself and the plate, which does feel very akin to like my witch practice, you know?
Yeah. And that kind of particular focused concentration. And I think I talked a little bit with Ali Norman about it
Oh,
too,
yes.
because she's of course does the etching, and she gets to use the flame underneath the plate and do all of that too, and that she really has that feeling of ritual is powerful. Ritual is something that humans need, I think, and
Yeah.
something that we're kind of robbed of in contemporary society in the US. A lot of us, if we don't come especially from a strong cultural tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I mean, like one of my ex-boyfriends, I would text him if I was going into like an etching session or a printing session, and I'd be like, hey, I am not going to respond for like 3 hours, and just be prepared, because no, I will not be looking at my phone, because I'm
Yeah.
just going to be having this connection with whatever I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, well, you really can't just like send me a text every once in a while. And I'm like, I'll send you a text when I'm done printing.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't want, like, this is sacred to me. Like,
Yeah.
I don't like having the interruptions. And I am kind of that like solitary part of my hedge witchery
Mm-hmm.
definitely kind of transfers into both my printing practice and my artistic practice of like,
Yeah.
I do like to have a rather quiet environment. I kind of have my time alone, more or less, or with somebody helping me sponge, and just have that time just
Yeah.
in that moment, and more or less oblivious of the outside world.
I heard an interview with a brain scientist kind of dude. As you can tell, I paid close attention to his credentials, but it sounded legit. I'm sure, I think it was on NPR. And he was saying that when we get interrupted, it takes us 23 minutes to get back to the level of
Oh, wow.
concentration that we were at, which really surprised me, because most people think, oh, I don't know, like maybe 2 minutes to get back in. But if we're doing something creative and we get a text and we stop and we look at our phone, it actually takes over 20 minutes for the average person to get back to that level of focus that they had. So I think your practice of intentionally telling the outside world, this isn't the time for you,
Yeah.
I'm sure
This
is.
brain scientist and I have something
Yes.
in
Are
common.
you a brain scientist, Brian?
I
So yeah, I think that's a really good practice. And since I've learned of that, I've tried to put my phone away or in another room or on do not disturb when I'm trying to do something that does require focus, when before I just thought, oh, I'm sure it's fine, but maybe it's not fine. Maybe we should
Yeah.
have that time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of your print arc, your print story, I feel like we've gotten up to Tamarind, basically.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
what year was it that you started at Tamarind?
I started 2020.
And so was the
Because
pandemic already on? So you already kind of knew going
yes.
into it, I'm going to be having a different sort of experience.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I started working on my application because, again, very type A. I think I started working on my application in July 2019, and they're normally due like the second week of January.
I was going to say, aren't they?
Yeah. But again, like I had about a couple months out of school, and then I was like, nah, I want to
Yeah.
I want to go to Tamarind. And I knew it was something that my last like 3 years of undergrad, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna apply. And I think it was Christine Adams who tracked me down at SGCI in Dallas at Open Portfolio, and I think she was in the midst of either doing the first or the second year, I don't remember. But she found me and she's like, you're applying to Tamarind, right? And I was like, yeah, if you think that's right, like, I guess so. And so I applied, and it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
Just the application process of like, I think I had, and I shit you not, probably 60 different drafts of my like letter of intent. I was trying to figure out who would be the best reference, working on my resume, and then collecting images. They do ask that you submit a portfolio, but like, it's mostly to see mostly for them to see that you know how to print litho.
Yeah.
I'm not giving away some big Tamarind secret there. But I applied, and then I was waitlisted. So I think I was waitlisted somewhere in February. And Brandon Gunn is, I swear, an angel on this earth. And he offered the like, well, we'd just love to see a little bit more of the collaborative experience. Like, you're so
Mm.
just out of school, try and spend a little bit time working at High Point or another shop, or just to get a little bit more of that under your belt. And I was like, okay, okay. And then I think like 2 weeks later was when, what was it, the date? March 13th of like
Yeah.
COVID hitting and
Yeah.
them being like, we're going to shut down for 2 weeks. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I
And then
remember
everything,
those days. Yeah.
yes. And I was like, okay, so much for working in any sort of shop because they are all closed. How can I make this work? And so I had my own small studio set up and I was working on my own litho and I was trying to reach out to and figure out, like, is there a way I can invite artists that I know and we can work from it, or can I drop a stone off at their apartment? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think I sent an email to Brandon basically being like, hey, like, I was just curious if the summer workshop is going, like, if that's, I haven't seen if that's been canceled or not, but if it is, like, is that something that I could come participate in just to get a little bit under my
Mm-hmm.
belt? And he sent me an email back, and I remember because I had accidentally locked myself out of my phone for about 2 days. And I came back and had gotten this email from Brandon saying, well, yes, we've canceled the summer workshop, but we've had a spot open up and it's yours if you'd like it.
Oh.
And I was ecstatic. But this was about this time, like end of May.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pandemic, we were 2 months into the pandemic, and I went, well, how the shit is this going to work?
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, damn, like I'm 2 months behind everybody else on finding housing and making this work. And
Mm-hmm.
do I have to quit my job? Like,
Yeah.
and I had been furloughed, but I was like, do I, like, how does, and made it work. I found housing. And then I think about another week after that, I got another email from Brandon basically being like, hey, so here's the deal. Like, it was specifically, I think, more so for some of the international students who were having trouble with all of the borders being closed.
Yeah.
Of, we are going to give you the option to defer if you'd like to. And that kind of threw another wrench in the, like, okay, well, now I've been accepted, but do I defer another year? Do I go? Like, what am I doing? And so ultimately I decided to go and move down to Albuquerque, but I had to move down about 3 or 4 weeks earlier than I had planned because we had to quarantine the 2 or 3 weeks before starting classes. So I was moved down to Albuquerque in the end of July, and then my
That's
mom
exactly
drove
what they did in the Great British Bake Off.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
And my mom drove the 20 or so hours with me from Minnesota down to Albuquerque, and then my Tamarind journey began, and I was ecstatic. I knew Alyssa Ebinger, who is doing the second year when I was down there, who she actually went to the same undergrad that I did a couple. Well, I'm really sorry, Alyssa, if you listen to this. I think you were 10 years before me or so. I don't want to age you. That's not what I'm trying to do, I promise. But that was part of the decision that I had decided to go, is because we knew of each other across internet land, but just to have a little bit of the home state down in Albuquerque, because that was the farthest that I had ever moved, was a big part of my decision. But then it was a bit of an odd year because there was only 3 of us, when usually the class is at least 6, normally 7 or 8, and it works best when there's even numbers because you're kind of always paired up with printer and sponsor, and you're switching between. So for us to be a class of 3 was a little weird.
Yeah. And so you got to have this unique Tamarind experience, but still came out the other side with the Tamarind experience, which is wonderful.
Yes, and I would not trade it for the world.
Yeah.
It really was like one of the best experiences of my life. It was amazing. It was absolutely exhausting and grueling and the hardest thing I have ever done, but so worth it.
Oh, that's
so worth it.
So cool to hear. Yeah. So I'm always curious for artists who are interested in the collaborative side of things, but also have their own practice as an individual artist, as the person doing the drawing and the printing. How does that fit into the way you see yourself as an artist and as a maker, and kind of the different hats that you wear doing those different projects?
Yeah, upon graduating from Tamarind, I don't want to say that I had an identity crisis, but it was definitely this like newfound, do I like collaborative print? Do I not like collaborative print? And ultimately I do really love collaborative printing, and finding that balance between collaborative work and my own practice was a little tricky, but the way that I look at it is when I'm in a collaboration, I am solely focused on the needs of the artist. Like, how can I help this artist with what mark are they trying to make? What are they trying to do with this print? Like, do we need to scrap this layer? Do we need to add a layer? Do we need to switch colors? Were the first colors that we mixed like the colors that were right in the first place, but we just needed to go on a journey? And my sole focus is making sure that they are happy and are getting what they need from me as a printer and as a lithographer. Now, being the type A sort of person that I am also just storing away little nuggets of information in my head of seeing how they approach the medium, because my practice as a lithographer, it's grown, but I'm so drawing heavy. But seeing how that they use these materials in a different way that I would have never thought of, because I have this sanctity of like how the quote unquote correct way to use these materials, which is utter bullshit. Throw some of that out of the door and draw with the side of the crayon, or stick your finger onto the stone, which is just like I just heard some of the lithographers gasp. But that's, I like to, like notice how an artist who may or may not have experienced litho or experienced print, like work with these new materials and kind of store that away for my either my own knowledge or to use in a future collaboration if an artist is trying to troubleshoot something. But I kind of have found that they do need to exist in separate planes between my artistic practice and collaborative print.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it is very much sounds like getting into a different space and different motivation and different level of outcome expectation, and
Yes.
all of that is that it's really different. But of course, I'm sure they inform each other too. That what you learn something in your own image making that you can then take with you into collaborative making.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a collaboration I did with an MFA student at Tamarind. Her name is Sarah Veit. And she had done a litho, I think maybe in her undergrad or maybe in graduate school by herself, but just was not a printmaker and just had a hell of a time with it. But she can just uses these like really beautiful, subtle tonal shifts. And it was one moment, because a lot of the times if I'm in a collaboration, I have my own, my knowledge as an artist present, but it's not about me, right? Like it's not it's about the artist, it's about the print in a collaboration. But she was just like, well, this is what I'm planning, this is the sort of image that I want to make. I've tried this before, but it didn't really succeed, and I was wondering if you have any, like, she's like, I've looked at your own work, and she's like, you kind of have these same sort of subtle tonal shifts that I'm after, and I want to know how you do it. And I was just like, well, have you ever used a number 7 litho crayon? Like, and she was like, no. And I was like, okay, here you go. And I grained a stone, I think all the way down to like 320 or something, just so it was so smooth. And I gave her a number 7, and she was like in love. And that's, every so often my artistic knowledge does come up, but I try to keep it aside unless it's really, really needed, because it's not about me. It's about the print. It's about the,
Yeah. So speaking of your personal practice,
yes,
how would you kind of describe where it is right now on the other side of the pandemic, of interstate moving, of getting the intensive litho training, doing a lot of collaborative work, and now, as you mentioned, being in a situation where you're printing small scale and using what you have? Where are
Yeah.
you right now with all that?
Right now, I feel pretty good. I will say, going from the beautiful, beautiful shop that Tamarind is to
Mhm.
my little Dickerson combo press in more or less of a, like it's my studio space is more or less in a garage.
Mm.
It was a bit of an adjustment, but here's 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 the way that I guess I look at it. That, like, I mean, as printmakers, I feel like we're almost like professional DIYers
Mhm.
sometimes. We're always trying to find a way. And I am fortunate enough to have my own press. But within, I think, literal days of being home from Tamarind, I was back into it and I was printing because I was just in this groove from printing down at Tamarind. I mean, you're printing 7 days a week sometimes.
Mhm.
Like, I was just like, I don't know how to, like, it was synonymous with my lifestyle. And so I think I was home and I drew a really quick plate, a quick little 2-layer litho, and was like, I'm gonna print, and I did.
Mm.
um just because the tenacity, I think, was there. I'm a very determined, like I said, double earth sign. Oh, it's less than ideal, but it works, and I think that's, at the end of the day, it works. Like, if you can get a setup that works, like, you don't need. Brandon Gunn says it perfectly, that really, to print a litho, you need a stone, you need a press, and you need a leather roller. Hell, you don't even technically really need a leather roller. If you
Mm.
have a brayer, that'll work. And I think that really, like, stuck with me
Yeah.
because I love litho, and there's like nothing that I feel like can come in my way. If I'm like, I want to print a litho, I'm gonna figure out a way to print a litho.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing can tear you apart. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, my personal, I've started working on a little bit of a smaller scale, both because of the the size of my workshop. Like, my press bed could potentially handle full sheet. It would be a stretch, but it's also just, I mean, it's resources.
Yeah.
I can print these lithos, but, like, I mean, I'm a working artist. I don't have a lot of money.
Mm.
Is the truth.
Yeah.
So, especially like this winter, it was like, well, I want to print litho and I don't want to waste all of my resources on printing one big one. So, like, I'll cut this plate up, and if I have these really smaller matrices, then I can do more runs, I can do more colors, I can print more layers, I can print more litho. And so I started working at a smaller scale, both because of my space and monetarily. And it's the one tricky part about my current space is that the inside is heated, thankfully, here in Minnesota. That is,
Yeah. When you
that
said
is
garage and I knew it was in
yeah,
Minnesota, I was like, oh, honey, are you
it
okay?
it is heated. But I do not have water. So when it comes
Oh,
to needing to grain a stone, it has to happen outside. And my graining sink is essentially one of those old, like, hospital carts or like lunch carts with, like, it's got a little bit of a lip. I think I found it on Facebook Marketplace or something like that, and it was like $10 just to take it away. And I was like, yeah, this is more than big enough for me to make a graining sink. And it's got a lower tray to it and then the upper part. And it's got enough of a lip that it holds the water and the grit without all of it, like, gushing out. And I drilled a hole in it so that there's a pipe and a drain that goes down to a bucket to collect the water and separate it from the grit. And that's my graining setup. But I can only really grain from maybe May-ish to about October,
yeah.
and then it just starts getting really cold and we have to shut off the water outside, otherwise our pipes freeze. So I also started printing at a smaller scale because, well, I had to print off of plates, and
Yeah.
I can't reuse plates. So yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of the context of your work and kind of what you're exploring, really early on in the interview, you said something so intriguing about this intersection of queerness and rural middle America,
Yes.
which I think a casual observer of the United States might believe that that's a contradiction, but anyone who's been queer in the United States will know queer people are everywhere,
Where?
everywhere. And that's part of what I have really loved about that is that it is kind of pushing back against that idea that's like, queer people exist in major cities in June. Like that idea.
Yep.
Well, of course, that's not the case. But I want to hear, of course, your thoughts on it and your reflections and how that manifests in your work.
Yeah. I got this, and I'd like to preface this with like, this is just my experience as a queer individual going to a rather small state school. There was the battle of like going to school in a small town in and of itself, but then I battled with faculty and my classmates of them being like, well, you say that your work is queer, but like, how? And it was like, well, like, it's like, do I need to be drawing half naked, able bodied men for you to believe that my work is queer? Or can the fact that I am a queer individual making queer work just inherently, it's queer? And I was working off of, towards the end of college a lot, I was very interested in like semiotics and the relationship of text and imagery and the way that queer people communicate. And that is still, it shows itself every once in a while in my current body of work, but right now I'm more so focused on more or less like these scenes that were so formative to me as a queer child growing up in, rural Midwest. It's synonymous with my work is, I'm queer, so my work is inherently queer. And being this child running through the woods, that is inherently more or less queer because I was a queer child running through the woods. And I'm very, very interested in that relationship and illustrating it. A lot of the scenes that I've been drawing are mostly from memory. Sadly, the area surrounding my grandmother's farm is slowly being encroached by developments, as is what happens. Thankfully, her farm is more or less untouched, but I remember like sending my twin out when I was down at Tamarind, and we were doing like a quick little one of the first projects for a semester. And I remember sending him out, and I'm like, I just can't remember this. Can you like do what I'm talking about? Like, can you go and take a picture of this for me? And he's like, yeah, I got it. Like, we are of the same mind. And it's that interest in the queer existence and my queer memory and the queer domesticity and what it's like living in and occupying these spaces that people are like, oh, well, that's a barn. Like, queer people don't live there. Like, and it's just like, man, like, it is 2022. Like,
barns are a straight building. I'm just telling you that right now. It's a straight building.
They're heterosexual and for heterosexuals only. Like,
a barn is a cis building. You can tell by looking at it. Like, it's just, anyway, that's just a really funny idea. But I'm also laughing in recognition too that like that is how people understand it. I think it truly is that idea of queer spaces and straight spaces, and of course there's certainly some truth in that.
Yeah,
but I think also like it's a step beyond the binary to try and start to melt that and say a queer space is where there are queer people, which means literally everywhere.
Yes. And like, it's obviously this is something that we're used to as a society of like where queer people exist and why they exist there. And historically, yes, we're going to find San Francisco is going to have, these cities are going to have, and I mean, me myself, I live in uptown Minneapolis because ultimately that is where I do feel more comfortable because of the tendency for queer individuals to more or less flock to those areas because there is lesser prejudice against us. Now, not saying that it's not existent, because it's an ever-going battle, as we see for minority groups. But that tends to be the I hate using this word, but the norm, right? But the spaces that we live in, that we inhabit, regardless of whether they're rural or inner city or suburban or what have you, they're in my eyes, meant to be reclaimed and lived
Mm.
in by queer individuals, by whoever wants to live there. Their space, their ever going spaces of transition, and are often temporary and
Mm.
ever changing. And there's something in that I find really cohesive with my identity as a non-binary individual and my identity as a queer person, to have it be ever shifting and changing, and like it's not always going to stay the same. And I think to try and stay in that same spot is, well, madness, but
Mm-hmm.
more or less detrimental. Like it's good to change, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely connect with what you're saying as I enter my late 30s. I feel like I can see that kind of in myself, this idea of, well, I know everything's changed for every generation before me, but how come things are changing in my generation? And it's just, it's not necessarily that I feel a resistance to it, but almost like a surprise, like truly like, oh, like this is different than it was when I was in high school, when I was an undergrad, when I was in my 20s. I mean, all of that. And it's this weird thing that is such a, I mean, I was going to call it a flaw, but maybe it's actually just here to teach us a lot. Is every human being I know thinks whatever's happening, it's going to be the forever. And we consistently are surprised by change, despite the fact that it's the only actual consistent we've ever experienced. And it's a lesson that we have to learn over and over again. And I think a lot of the resistance that you do see in people is resistance just to the fact that this is different than what I
Yes.
expected. And this is different than what I'm used to. And therefore, I'm not here for it. When,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's, I mean, I think specifically at SGC, this year was phenomenal on a lot of just, I get to see these people in person again. But like, it was a lot of my work. I really either had barely posted about or hadn't posted about, and had it at SGC. And so I didn't quite know what to expect or what people would think. Not that it matters what people think, but like I was just so excited to be around other people. And
Mm.
the real heartwarming bit was having this little prairie scene, more or less, that I had, this little prairie litho that I had drawn, and the sheer number of queer individuals
Mm.
and other minority groups who were just like, this reminds me of my grandmother's farm, or like this reminds me of this, or then I'm just like, oh, okay, good. I'm not the only one. It was a nice moment of, I guess, solidarity is the word I'm looking for,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not quite right. But it was really, really just nice to see, just to have that sort of bonding moment with someone who is just like, oh, well, sometimes it can be really isolating, and to see other people have lived similar experiences as
Mm.
this little rural child did. It's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah. I love
Yeah.
that. Well, we're actually already have been chatting for an hour, which I
Oh,
can't
wow.
believe. So I'm afraid I've come to the time where I have to ask you, where can people see your work? We talked about your wonderful Instagram handle, but
Yes.
definitely shout out that again and see it and connect with it and get in touch with you. And yeah, where are you
Yeah.
out there on the internet?
Instagram is my main platform. I think there's an old Tumblr that exists somewhere, but good luck finding it because it is not tied to anything.
Mhm.
But Instagram is hedgebitch, spelled exactly like how it sounds. That is the easiest way to get in contact with me. I will try and answer you. But again, sometimes I am printing and
Mhm.
I am dead to the outside world. And my website is Glitter Queen, but Queen is spelled Kween.
.com?
.com.
.com. Great. Well, we
glitterqueen.com.
can definitely put links to all that in the show notes. And yeah, I definitely understand. I feel like this is as good a time as any to apologize to anyone who sent me a DM through the Hello Print Friend Instagram and never heard from me, because it's like, I think it's like once you get over
a certain amount of followers, like 9 out of 10 or more of those things in there is just weird spam. And so it's just like, that's just not the best way. Like, if you need to tell me something important, find my email, please. It's just Miranda@helloprintfriend.com, because Instagram is just a steaming trash pile of bots with one or two actually nice people thrown in there. And like, I wish I had the time to go through that. But yeah, it's, oh man, there's so many lonely women who want to marry me in there. And or they say they want to chat, and then they give me a really long link I need to click on. It's just, yeah. Nope. Sorry, ladies. This professional has other things to do. A tangent. But yeah, thank you so much, Brian, for talking with me. This has been really fun. I feel like we could talk about litho and queerness forever, which is just, I mean, who wants to talk about anything else? Truly. So yeah, I'll let you when I've got a publication date. And yeah, please stay in touch. And hopefully we can collaborate on something.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Have a beautiful rest of your afternoon.
You too.
Have you ever seen those bumper stickers that say, "Tell your dog I said hi"?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you that. Tell your sister's dog I said hi.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah.
If you like today's episode, we have a Patreon where you can help us keep the lights on and get bonus content, like Shop Talk Shorts, where our editor Timothy Pauschak digs deep on materials, processes, and techniques with past guests. Also, if you've listened this far, you might just be that special kind of print friend who would leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts. It would mean the world to us if you did. And that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Peter Santamaria, who you might know from his interweb handle, Attack Peter. He shares with us his story of growing up in Miami and finding refuge in pop culture where his folks were going through a pretty bad divorce, struggling to find his place in the fine art world before deciding to forge his own path, and the 13-year transition it took to being a full-time, salaried artist. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.